Hello and welcome back to HEMAFightBreakdowns. Today I am going to be going over the gold medal match from Lynx Cup 2025, which happened just last weekend. I was there, and thankfully for the first time in what feels like a long time, I was able to record in the slow-mo, so we're going to have some really nice footage for this one. And unfortunately, I did not do as well as maybe I would have hoped, and instead we're going to be watching the gold medal match, which does not feature me at all. But it does feature another installment of the Sam Ryals fan channel, and we are going to watch Sam Ryals fight Branden Zipplinger for first place. Now, the great thing about this fight is that, one, we know that both of these fighters are very experienced, but they don't actually necessarily have a lot of experience fighting each other. This is, as far as I know, one of the first times they've ever fought each other. So we're going to see a lot of really unique adaptations, and the other great thing about this fight is that it was something like 15 exchanges long, which means there was a lot of opportunity for both fighters to change up their game and try to counteract one another in the pursuit of victory. So for our first exchange, normally we would have a little bit of a feeling out period, but that doesn't really happen here. And one of the reasons that doesn't happen is Branden Zipplinger, who is fighting on the right side of the camera, where Sam is fighting on the left side of the camera, really loves to come in with a lot of really high-level aggression. Now, most of the time when people say that they're very aggressive, it usually means they're throwing in a really big attack. But in this particular case, Branden is what I consider to be a good expert on using aggression to force his opponent into a defensive mindset, but then necessarily going in and just throwing wildly, but using his opponent's defensive stance to try to force out a parry. And that's exactly what he tries to do here. He comes in with really aggressive footwork. It forces Sam to back up and get ready for a parry, at which point Branden throws a feinted left attack that turns into a right side attack and looks like it just barely misses. It just looks like it didn't quite have enough forward momentum. But one of the reasons this is important to consider is that it means that Branden did not just full send his attack. He was waiting to see whether or not Sam was going to try to parry it or whether or not he was going to be able to parry it. And upon seeing that he was able to get most of the way through with his right side attack, he doubles up and throws another cheeky little left hand snipe. And that's where that distance management really comes into play. Because at this point, Sam, who realizes that his opponent did not just land an attack on him, goes for that parry, doesn't quite get the parry on the hand shot, but returns a hand shot of his own. And we can see Branden immediately, upon landing his own hand shot, going up for a parry of his own. And the reality is that both of these people managed to try to do the same thing, but from different perspectives. Branden came in and forced a hand shot opening to present itself, at which point Sam just didn't quite throw up a good enough parry and kind of punched the sword a little bit, at which point, when he realized that he had thrown up a not-so-great parry, he threw a hand shot of his own, and thanks to the not-so-great parry from Branden, managed to land a hand shot as well. So a really great understanding of how you can use offense to try to open up your opponent, but also one where if you don't maintain your distance, you're not necessarily going to be in a good spot if and when you miss. Now, for our next exchange, it's going to be Sam this time who comes in with the aggressive attack. He feints a kind of right Zverkow, comes in with a very ballistic, very jumpy left Zverkow, and managed to just barely clip what looks like the hands of his opponent. At the exact same time as this is happening, Branden, who up until now was being very aggressive, is now being very defensive, goes backwards as fast as he can, and tries to, at least what appears to be, throw a hand snipe of his own. Of course, now there are two really important details about this jumping left Zverk that makes it successful, and one of them is the fact that it keeps your hands up on the high line, and it crosses the center as it attacks. One of the reasons that people can often get hand sniped so easily when they're coming forward with an attack is that classic attacks that come from high and then present towards the middle will have your hands exposed in this part of the attack where your blade is up here in the upper end, meaning that if someone tries to hit you in the head, they're going to have to get through your blade. But if your hands are down here and they go for your hands, chances are they're going to be right where they want them to be. And that is what I imagine was going through Branden's head when he threw this particular counterattack. He thought that because Sam was coming in with a high line attack, he was going to be able to throw this cheeky little middle how hand shot, and Sam's hands were going to be there. And of course they were not, because in this particular case, the left Zverkow that Sam threw keeps his hands neatly behind his crossguard and his blade the entire time. It doesn't necessarily keep you safe from hand shots, but it does keep you safe from low line shots. And that's an important thing to consider if you're going to be using this kind of thing in your own aggressive fencing. Now, I've skipped a few exchanges because, again, there were 15 and I can never cover them all, but this exchange in particular is what I see as a really important turning point in the fight. Up until now, both of these two fencers have been trading aggressive stances. They've both been deciding back and forth whether or not they were going to be aggressive or defensive, and they've both been trying to either get the parry repost when they're on the defensive or get that first initial feinted attack when they're on the aggressive. And in this case, we have Sam coming in as the aggressor, but we see two key adaptations from both fencers here. One is that when Sam takes a big step forward, he feints as though he's going to throw his big jumping left Sverk again, which he has thrown in some of the previous exchanges that I'm not showing. At the exact same time, Branden, who previously has been waiting to try to parry riposte that attack, makes an adaptation in that he recognizes when Sam is going to come forward, and he recognizes that he's probably going to throw a feint. So the first thing he does is, rather than go for that parry, he goes for that strike straight to the side of the head. Now, luckily, there was another adaptation on the side of Sam here, which is that he was not going to simply throw the exact same feinted attack that he has previously a few times, and instead takes a big step forward, waits for the counter shot, and then throws a parry. That's a really great sequence there, where you can see both fencers are trying to get into the loops of the other fencer and trying to figure out what they're going to do next, even though they haven't done it before. Of course, after that parry is landed, Sam tries to throw a low right Sverk and just finds himself just barely out of range to land it. He was probably trying to go for the hands, assuming that after Branden had thrown his initial shot, he was going to follow it up with another step forward, which would have put him in range to get the left side of his ribs cracked with this low right Sverk, but he was not there, and as a result, that Sverk misses. But there's another thing to talk about in this exchange, and that is the fact that after this exchange is over, Sam self-calls a shot to the head. And it's pretty interesting because when you watch the footage first, you might not see a shot to the head at all. But when you watch it in slow motion, you can figure out exactly what Sam is talking about. And this is another opportunity to talk about the dangers of self-calling. Because in my opinion, this shot to the head was not really intentional. What you see here is that after Branden throws his right side attack as his initial action and he gets parried, he kind of just comes around with a left Sverk that was mostly trying to just get in the way of what he thought was coming next. Of course, the next thing that was coming from Sam was that low right Sverk that also missed. And in my opinion, Branden did not intend to strike Sam in the head. What he probably tried to do was hit him in the hands and then leave measure. And as a result, this headshot is very glancing, not very good, but it definitely was felt by Sam. So as a result, despite the fact that the judges didn't think that it was good enough, he self-calls the headshot and gives him 2 clean points. And that, I think, was a bit of a mistake. This was a really, really great exchange that was, in my opinion, ruined by the fact that someone who was trying to do the right thing and be an honest fencer thought that something that had touched their head was actually a lot more intentional than it actually was. So our next exchange is more on brand with Sam here, given that he does an advancing step with a one-handed thrust and shows off just how well he can throw these one-handed techniques and still recover. One thing to pay attention to for this particular exchange is that not only does Sam appear to land the one-handed thrust, but he manages to pull out of it and manages to throw up another sequence of parry and riposts after his one-handed thrust seemingly hits, but also maybe got parried a little bit. The important thing to understand here is that whenever someone throws a one-handed attack, the one thing that you're looking for as the defender is to just get any kind of parry off, because at the end of the day, any kind of blade contact between these two interactions is going to result in the person with 2 hands on their sword winning those binds every single time. You will have the complete ability to dictate what happens. However, parrying is often very, very difficult when someone is coming forward with something that is now 6 or 8 inches longer than you really think it should. It makes it hard to measure up distance, and it also means that when you're not expecting it coming, you often don't throw the kind of parry that you wish you would have in this particular situation. The kind of parry that Branden throws here to try to set off this one-handed thrust is the exact kind of parry you want to see when you're the person throwing the thrust. He tries to do a Fiore-style back edge deflection, and the reason that is so problematic is because this one-handed thrust was aimed right here at the upper right shoulder, meaning that when you try to deflect, you have to get all the way past your body line before you're safe, and that's a lot of distance to travel. Normally, the short edge Fiore deflections are good because they don't actually have to travel quite as far as a normal wall parry, and as a result, they can economize your follow-up strike of just coming straight down on the same line. Branden tries to throw that, but he finds that not only was he unable to really get the thrust all the way off to the side like he maybe intentioned, but when he came back down, Sam had already recovered much of his blade presence and was able to pull his sword back from full extension to a kind of guard where at the very least it was going to get in the way of the cut that followed the deflection. So as a result, if you want to try to copy these two people, remember that anytime someone throws a one-handed strike, you need to make sure to get a hard, decent parry off. And if you do, you are almost guaranteed to get the maximum number of points that you can get in that tournament rule set. But just remember that when someone is throwing a one-handed technique, they're often very acclimated to that, and they know the advantages and they know the disadvantages. And don't think that just because someone throws a one-handed technique and you maybe did or didn't get that parry, that they're just wide open after the fact. You have to leverage that situation with a very decent parry. Otherwise, you're going to end up in a situation where the person who just hit you or didn't hit you with that one-handed strike is able to pull it back, pull up some kind of guard, and recover a lot faster than you maybe think is possible. So our next exchange is another one where we can get a really great understanding of the distance and timing games that were being played during this fight. Now in this particular exchange, it looks like a whole lot of nothing happens and then someone just gets a sneaky little headshot. But what you would probably not miss is the fact that the footwork that happened during this fight was pivotal to pulling off both of the techniques and the reason that the techniques that preceded it all failed. So what happens here is that Sam is coming forward with some aggressive but probing hand strikes. And as I've talked about probing hand strikes before, the basic idea is that you throw something that's very non-committal to try to get your opponent to do something committed so that you can capitalize on it. These intentions are not for these hand shots to really land. What they're intended to do is to get your opponent to do something, and they are successful in doing that. As Sam comes forward, he throws one feinted hand shot, then throws another feinted hand shot, and on the second one, Branden throws a very not so great parry, but also more importantly takes a big passing step backwards. Now, when you watch this feat in slow motion, what you see here is that Branden takes a big step backwards and then immediately starts trying to recover forward in order to maintain the distance that he had. And this is a classic opportunity for Sam here. He has caused his opponent to take one big step backwards and now one big step forward. And during that transition, he is going to be closing distance into range without necessarily having any control over where he ends up. This is a perfect opportunity to launch a forward attack because you know your opponent has to go forward, even if they don't want to be, and they just spent the last couple seconds trying to defend themselves from probing hand strikes, which means they're probably going to be looking to throw another parry. And again, that's exactly what happens. The only issue here is that the big passing step backwards that Branden took him far enough out of range that when Sam presents his blade forward and looks to be going for a kind of thrust, Branden's forward step doesn't quite get him close enough to just run into that thrust. Now, in my imagination, if Sam had lunged deep for this thrust, he probably would have landed it, as it seems that Branden's parry, which he does to try to set off that thrust, doesn't really come anywhere close to doing so. He probably would have actually walked straight into that tip. However, that's not what happened. As he takes his step forward, his feet land, and then he immediately does a little bit of a stutter step and launches an attack of his own. And this is another really great demonstration on how to capitalize on that kind of thing. Because in this case, Sam threw a technique that he thought his opponent was going to walk into. The second it misses, now Branden has the opportunity, because you know for a fact that when someone throws any kind of committed or even not so committed attack forward, they're probably going to go backwards. And when they're going backwards, they're probably going to be defensive. At this point, Branden pulls out of his once compromised position, throws a sneaky attack, manages to land it. I'm not 100% sure where it lands. It's not very clear from the footage. But what matters here is that distance and timing wise, Branden was able to go from a situation where he was definitely at a disadvantage to a situation where he was neutral and then capitalizing on a new situation in order to get the advantage back. And it happens all within the span of a second and a couple waves of his blade. It's a really great demonstration on how important it is to be able to understand when you're in a position of advantage, when you're in a position of disadvantage, and to know that the transition between these two can happen so quickly that oftentimes you can turn a bad situation into a good situation with nothing more than a change of footwork. Now, this next exchange was another really important turning point in the fight. And it's a turning point because, at least in my opinion, Sam makes a pretty big mistake here. He goes for a technique where he stands in tail guard and wants to throw a big Krumpau against a big ballistic attack. And inherently, there's nothing wrong with this particular sequence or play. The problem is where he does it and who he's doing it against. Now, up until now, Sam and Branden have essentially been trading situations where they both go in for a big attack that's usually feinted once or twice, and the result is either someone gets a nice parry riposte or someone lands that ballistic attack. As a result, Sam is clearly trying to think here that, okay, well, if I want to get that good parry riposte, I need to do two things. I need to A, present a target so that I can dictate what my opponent is going to do to me, aka come in with that big ballistic attack, and B, set myself up for that big, strong, effective parry. And again, there's nothing wrong with this particular application. Standing in tail guard certainly presents an opportunity to your opponent that is too good to resist, and at the same time, you know exactly what you're going to do. Throw that big Krumpau across your body, and if you land it, you're going to be in a very dominant position. The problem with this particular thing and the mistake isn't what he chose to do, but where he chose to do it. Sam takes maybe a half step out of his corner and then presents this tail guard. And you can even see the gears turning in Branden's head here where he thinks, oh, that's just bait. I'm not going to go for it. Wait, hold on. It's bait, but it's really good bait. I am going to go for it. And as he goes for it, you see Sam try to throw this big Krumpau, only to find that because he has backed himself into that corner and he has let Branden dictate the range at which he initiates his attack, he's too close, and as a result, he just can't get his sword to bear in time. So, what could be done a little bit better with this exact same sequence? Well, one, rather than going into tail guard, which in my opinion unnecessarily puts you a good 2 feet away from any actionable position, you can simply take a left plow and then point your sword off to the side. We see a lot of highly competitive fencers take this position because it does more or less the same thing. It keeps you in that position, in that left plow position, where your sword's kind of sorting off into nowhere, where your opponent says, oh, there's a big opportunity. I can come in right down towards the head or towards the middle of the chest, and they're going to have to windshield wiper all the way from their side, all the way to the center just to meet me. But because you're not all the way down in tail guard, you actually have a significant less amount of distance to travel, meaning that it's going to speed up your Krumpau. At the exact same time, because you're off there onto the side, your ability to maybe turn it into a Zorn and then present your tip is also a lot faster. So a difference of position would have definitely meant a lot. But at the end of the day, we can't discount the fact that this tail guard was essential to getting Branden to do exactly what Sam wanted him to do. So even if we're going to keep the tail guard here aspect, what we have to add is a backward step. And this is why the critical mistake here, in my opinion, was doing it so close to the corner. Sam put himself in a position where he could not effectively back up without leaving the arena. And because of the rule set of this tournament, you could not score as you were leaving. Essentially meaning that Sam not only had to go from tail guard to this big Krumpau, but he had to do so without any backward motion to help open the distance and give himself the kind of time he needed to successfully make that Krumpau. Because if he had taken his big step backwards, he would have left the ring, and anything he did after that would have been completely thrown out. So, again, if you want to try to pull this off yourself, A, maybe don't go into tail guard, but if you're really dead set on going into tail guard, make sure to take some space towards the center of the ring first. So this way, when your opponent does exactly what you want them to do with that big ballistic thrust or cut to the head, you will have the ability to take a big step backward yourself, equalizing the kind of distance and the change in momentum, and giving yourself a huge amount of extra time to actually land that parry, at which point you can capitalize on the overcommitment of your opponent and land the follow-up techniques that you really want to land. So our next exchange is going to take us back in time a little bit to about 2018, 2019 HEMA, pre-COVID HEMA. And the reason for that is because we see a little bit of a Zvercopter here from Sam. But one thing that people might not appreciate very much is why this kind of thing was such a big meta in those early days and why it's such an intelligent application here. One of the things about Zvercopters, as I said all the way back in the first exchange, is that it tends to pull the action up towards the level of the shoulders. And the reason that's important to be doing here is because so far in these exchanges, Branden has been doing a great job of backing up and hitting these hand shots at the lower line. The reason they work, of course, is, as I said before, is that whenever you're throwing traditional kind of top to bottom attacks, your hands tend to be low while your blade is high. So if you have the instinctual action of taking a step back and throwing a middle cut across where you expect people's hands to be, you are going to land them a lot of the time. But by bringing up the action to the level of the shoulders with these Zwercows, what Sam is doing is two things. One, he's taking away the most common target that he's been getting hit at. His hands are going from the low area to the high area. And most importantly, two, because Branden's hands are going to be low when he throws these low Zwerks, or these low hand shots, he is going to be at risk of exposing his upper targets. So by coming in with a Zwercopter, what you're essentially saying is, I'm going to accept the fact that you're going to try to take my low line, and I am going to accept the fact that as long as I have the aggressive forward momentum and I can get you into this pattern, I am going to make you cede your high line to me. And as a result, when he comes forward, they have a couple of exchanges where someone throws a cut, someone throws a parry, and they just keep Zwerking out of it. But what you can recognize here is that at some point, Branden takes a step back and throws that low hand shot and does look like he lands it. But the exact same time this happens, Sam essentially is saying, I don't care. I am going to throw something at your head. And if you don't have your hands up here at the level of this Zwercopter, you're going to get hit eventually in one of those deep targets, and I'm going to get the advantage. Now, unfortunately, this is also relatively close to the end of the fight. So while this would normally be a really great adaptation and one that would spell the real change in the pace of the fight, it doesn't quite have enough legs to keep going. Now, this next exchange is a crazy one, but it's crazy because, well, one, we see some half sorting, but two, because it actually follows along the same principles of adaptation that I lined out in the previous exchange. Remember that the whole point of this Zwercoptering that we saw in the previous one was that it keeps the action up here on the high line, and half sorting unironically does the same thing. The idea here is that when you go into half sword and you present your blade up here, it does two things. One, it moves your hands from low to high, and while it doesn't do as good of a job of protecting your arms as maybe Zwercoptering would, it does do the same thing of saying, hey, if you go low, this blade is coming right here whether you like it or not. You accept the risk of getting hit somewhere else and say, you have to play my game. You have to come up to my level where we are going to do whatever it is that I want us to do. And in this case, it's half sorting. Now, unfortunately, this one doesn't quite work out the same because it looks like the half sword didn't quite get up high enough to actually parry the incoming blow, which managed to come in very vertical and looks like it hits around the top of the head. So at the exact same time, it looks like a little bit of a double. But what's important to note here is that this is, again, another clear instance of an adaptation here where Sam is trying to pull the action up high where he will have the advantage in being able to avoid the low hand shots that has been keeping Branden in the game this entire time. But that brings us to our final exchange, and unfortunately it is a little bit of a whimper, especially compared to the last two, but it is still an important one to analyze because what we have here is a classic, you're tied and you need 1 point and you go for the Geistling technique. And the reason this is a good idea is, as I've said time and time again, that when you throw one of these non-committal Geistling strikes and you take a step backwards at the same time, you pretty much put yourself in a position where you can get a free point and then leave, and even if you miss, well, the action just kind of resets. You have everything to gain and virtually nothing to lose. But what's also important to analyze here is that normally one-handed kooky stuff is very much the domain of Sam. And the reason I think that you have not seen so many one-handed things from Sam is because normally Sam uses these one-handed things to control the pace of a fight against defensive fencers. And he's not fighting a defensive fencer. He is fighting someone who is very, very good at making sure that he is always applying pressure, even if he's not attacking, into forcing some kind of action to happen. And as a result, one-handed attacks felt too risky. So it's very interesting to see here that after an entire fight of, again, like 15 exchanges of two people who are giving an immense amount of pressure to one another, to see Branden make the decision to, in the final moments when it really matters, let off the gas completely, throw a completely non-committal one-handed strike, the kind of thing that Sam would love to do, and then get the better of that exchange, while Sam, who comes forward right into measure, right into the center of the ring, is obviously waiting for that pressure. It's the perfect opportunity to throw a Geistling, and it would have been the perfect opportunity for both of them, but in this case, it looks like Branden is the one who figures it out first and comes away with the win. So, a really great fight, a really great demonstration of how you can use pressure and footwork and aggressive tactics to try to dictate the pace of a fight, but most importantly, how just because somebody who is really good at something might be able to dictate that to their opponent doesn't mean that you shouldn't have some backups. We saw Sam have some really great adaptations to the kinds of things that he was experiencing, and if maybe he had pulled onto them a little bit earlier, he might have been the one to come out on top of this fight. However, it was Branden who won, and Branden who got the gold medal, so unfortunately we're going to have to rescind our next invitation of Sam to the fan club, and until he wins another gold, he's banned from the channel. Sorry. So if you'd like to see more videos like this, I'm going to have another one out on Thursday. It's also going to be Lynx Cup, and it's probably going to be one of my fights, and it's probably going to be in slow motion again. So if you like this kind of thing, I will see you then.